I'd like to begin with a very remarkable verse in the first chapter of Genesis 26. It reads, "And God said, let us create humanity in our image, after our likeness." Now wait a minute. What did God just say? Let's read that again. Let us create humanity in our image, after our likeness. What's God talking about here? Who's this us and our? Who is this we that God is self-identifying as? Why doesn't the text read, "And God said, let me create humanity in my image, after my likeness"? But that's not what is said. The Hebrew word for God used here is Elohim. And Elohim appears frequently in the Torah, in the plural. And even when it is used with a singular verb, it often has plural adjectives. So we see this frequently in the Torah, that Elohim is plural. So who is this plurality? What exactly is this multiplicity that gives rise to the use of the plural pronouns? We're into pronouns these days, as you recall. So, fortunately, God answers this question directly in the very next verse, which reads, "So God created human beings in the image of God, male and female." So right there we have it. Male and female is the image of God. Male and female is the likeness of God. God self-identifies as androgynous right here at the beginning of the Bible. And this verse stands in some ways as a very remarkable proof text, if you will, for in the entire Judeo-Christian tradition, for the gender inclusivity of God, the fact that God is in some sense androgynous. What does that mean? God is male and female. In some sense, we can say God is half male, half female. And in particular, let us stick with that moment, that phrase, God is half female. Because on the face of it, it's a very bold and provocative statement. And like all statements about God, anything we can say about God is limited, because we are limited to the use of human conceptual thought and word. So we should always be mindful that anything we say or think about God, God is more than that, and God is different from that. And in that sense, anything we say or think is mistaken, if you will. Nevertheless, we have no choice. This is the language that we have. We work with human thought and conception. And this particular image of God as inclusive of both male and female is given to us right at the beginning of the Judeo-Christian tradition. However, as we all know, this got quickly lost, and that the feminine side of God has been denied, and with it, the whole divine status of the feminine and of women. And this has had ruinous consequences. And as most of you also know, in the unity tradition, this was perceived by Charles and Myrtle Fillmore and the other early unity leaders with great foresight. And in the very first class of graduating unity ministers in 1906, nearly half were women. There were 9 of them, and 4 of them were women. So, how did this happen? How did this half of God get dropped off? And what have been the consequences? So, there are many different theories about this. And very briefly, I'll mention one that Cynthia and I have found particularly inspiring. And this is the work of Gerda Lerner, who was an historian back in the second half of the 20th century. And she studied women's history. She studied it very carefully for decades. And she wrote a number of books. Her best known, or probably one, is called Creation of Patriarchy, and another one is called Rise of Feminist Consciousness. And what she did that was so remarkable, because she really approached it as an historian, and she was really amazed by what she found. She did not expect to find this. She studied all these different ancient civilizations and the emergence of essentially patriarchal culture in these civilizations, some of them quite disparate, all the way back to Mesopotamia in 3100 BCE. And in that sweeping research of history, she found one factor in common that was correlated with the emergence of patriarchy in these different societies. And that factor was that patriarchy emerged when women's connection to the divine was somehow severed or denied. This was an essential factor that she found in common across all these different civilizations. And once that happened, once the connection for women in the society directly to their divine source was somehow repudiated or denied, then patriarchal structures and customs began to creep in. And before long, you had women in a subjugated role, and you had sexuality, and also women's reproductive capacities became commodities, and to some extent bought and sold and traded and possessed. And all of these factors, and she does this very carefully and very forensically by looking at the laws encoded in these ancient civilizations. And these patriarchal customs and norms are embedded in the legal codes. Fascinating study. So that was one factor. The other factor was the emergence of the female as inherently inferior. And this goes back, we don't know how far, but it's very definitely there in both Plato and Aristotle. And Aristotle in particular said that the female is, as it were, a mutilated male. And to give proof of this in the case of the human female, he cites the smaller frame of the woman's body and the inherent superiority of semen over blood. To him, that was self-evident. Maybe because it wasn't as dark. I don't know. But you can find it in Aristotle. And based on these kinds of arguments, it was concluded that the female is inherently inferior to the male. And what Gerda Lerner says, and she does this with tremendous scholarship, I'm just very much briefly summarizing really decades of remarkable research. But what she says is that these beliefs became so embedded as to become invisible and beyond question. And hence, the patriarchal structures of society became accepted as normal, as the way things naturally are. And this is a very powerful example of the third unity principle, that our way of thinking creates our reality. And in this case, the reality of the oppression of the feminine was created by these ways of thinking that were so deeply ingrained, we lost awareness that we even were thinking that way. So, those were the two founding metaphors, according to Gerda Lerner, of the entire Western civilization. One, that God is male and male only. And two, that the female is inferior. Now, what about the other Abrahamic religions? What do we find there? And let's take Islam. Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. Rahman and Rahim both come from the same root Rahma, which means womb. And so there's a way in which, of course, Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim, Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim means in the name of the infinitely compassionate, infinitely merciful. Compassion and mercy. Qualities we often associate with the feminine, although of course they're not limited to the feminine. But it's very interesting, and the Quran also says that my mercy is greater than my wrath. These qualities are associated, and they come from the root word womb, which suggests something about God caring for creation and for all beings in a somewhat similar way that the mother cares for her offspring, both in the womb and as her child. In Judaism, we have the feminine aspect of God, Shekhinah, which is given many different interpretations, but it's essentially the feminine essence of divine presence. And then we have Sophia, wisdom, which is understood as female. And in the Kabbalah, which emerged around the 12th century or so, according to Daniel Mott and other mystical Kabbalistic scholars, the entire Kabbalah is a critique of patriarchal religion. And it is an esoteric map of the creation of the universe out of the Ein Sof, out of the absolute Godhead, in the tree of life, with what are called the 10 Sephirot. And half of those 10 are male and half of them are female. And so you have this inherent masculine and feminine duality in all of the esoteric superstructures descending out of the Godhead into the manifest creation, from the Keter to the Malchut, and those are the 10 Sephirot. So we have this very remarkable kind of gender duality in the Jewish tradition. And Rabbi Mark Samath, in his article in the New York Times called "Is God Transgender?", makes very important points about the Jewish tradition. In particular, he says the tetragrammaton, the Yahweh, the 4 Hebrew letters that make the unpronounceable name of God. And what he says is that the Israelite priests would have read these letters in reverse as Hu He. And this refers to the hidden name of God in Hebrew, and Hu He means he, she. And so he's basically saying the hidden name of God in Hebrew is he, she. And he says this is a quote: "In the ancient world, well-expressed gender fluidity was the mark of a civilized person. Such a person was considered more godlike. In ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt, the gods were thought of as gender fluid, and human beings were considered reflections of the gods, made in the image of God. Counter to everything we grew up believing, the God of Israel, the God of the 3 monotheistic Abrahamic religions, to which fully half the people on the planet today belong, was understood by its earliest worshipers to be a dual-gendered deity." So this is his claim. And of course, if we then look to the East, which Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, we find this kind of gender duality really permeating these traditions. Wisdom itself, prajnaparamita in Buddhism, is female. And the most dramatic kind of depiction of that is the Buddha with the consort, the sort of the male and the female deities in some erotic union, the Yabyum. And there are many different consort relationships throughout the Hindu pantheon and the Buddhist deities, as I'm sure you're all familiar. So I want to share a personal story which relates to my own experience, and we all have our different experiences of God, of divinity in different ways. This is a visionary experience, and it happened 30 years ago at a time when I was really in transition from my scientific training and career into a whole new vocation. And it was right around the time we were beginning this gender equity and reconciliation work. But I want to say something about visionary experiences in spiritual life. Speaking first from Charles Fillmore, who says this very beautifully: "One of the most delicate subjects that the metaphysician has to deal with is that of visions and dreams. Visions and dreams are from the Lord more often than we think, but they need right interpretation." So this is very important because, and especially in our scientific materialist worldview, we are conditioned to dismiss visions and dreams as of the just my imagination. And we dismiss the whole imaginal world and the imaginal realm as not real. And in doing so, we lose a whole capacity, a whole epistemological faculty of the subtle realms of knowing. As Einstein himself said, imagination is more important than knowledge. If we dismiss the imaginal realm, we don't realize that it's actually a whole pathway of a different kind of knowledge. As Carl Jung called it, active imagination is a whole pathway for discovering deeper, more hidden truths. So, in my case, at that time I was meditating intensely. I was immersed in spiritual training and meditation. And I was really grappling with what is the essence of the divine, but also in particular the feminine aspect of the divine. And I really wanted to know. And I really had this feeling like I have to know this. It's very important to me to know. And I also had this concern. Maybe I am projecting. Maybe I am making things up. I had a number of experiences. I wanted to understand what's it really all about? And what is this essence of divinity that is so-called feminine? And I came to a place where I felt a kind of desperation, like I really want to know. I don't care what the truth is, even if it's that I'm just shown that it's all my projection, my fantasy, my invention. Fine, just show me that. Whatever it is, please show me. And I sat with that this kind of culminated, and so it was probably about a period of a week where I was sitting with that each time I was on the meditation cushion, in intensive prayer, asking and sitting and asking. And at one point one day, complete out of the blue, as I was sitting there, and my normal field of view, meditating, is just, you close your eyes and it's a kind of a dark, black, gray screen. That's it. And suddenly that screen tore open, almost like a curtain was opened up. And into my field of inner view stepped a exquisite, luminous female being, deity, with an unbelievably, indescribably beautiful green luminescent light. And it was astounding. It was absolutely not anything I expected or could have expected or had any concept of. It was definitely a female, divine, radiant being. And the radiance was so intense, it permeated my being, and it was so incredibly beautiful. There was only one thing I could do. Remember, I'm a scientist now. And what I did, scientists don't do. But I bowed. My entire being folded forward in a full bow because there was nothing else to do. This scintillating, penetrating, exalted beauty was so overwhelming. The irony, of course, is that in bowing, I then couldn't see her anymore because I folded myself into a bow, but that radiance poured through me and all around me. And it's a very personal experience, and I don't often share it, because it's very important with these kinds of experiences. As Charles Fillmore also says, we have to take them seriously, but not too seriously. If we become enamored of them, then we can get hung up. Or we can become, I don't know what it is, sort of self-important about it, or whatever it might be. But if we ignore them, how can we ignore these gifts given by Spirit? And what Charles says is really beautiful here. He says, the visions that we have seen are from the Lord, And if we acknowledge these occult hidden things as being real, and in the silent recesses of our souls become obedient, this in turn will lead to a clearer revelation, and soon we shall have the door open between us and our higher selves. Now that's a very important statement, and that is a beautiful expression of my own experience, because that experience, I've had a number of similar experiences since then, and a number of different kinds of manifestation of what I would call the feminine divine. And they became a very strong answer to my question, because part of my question was, I was starting this gender equity and reconciliation work. Is this just Will projecting all of his fantasies onto some reality? And to me, the answer is absolutely and clearly no. I mean, that experience was just one example. There's no way I could have made that up. I couldn't have conjured that up. If I did, I would have imagined it as some imaginal thing, but this was like literally a veil tore open and something was revealed. And that is the nature of these visions. And Charles says here finally, Joseph said that his dreams and visions were interpreted by God. All who go to the Lord for the interpretation get a lesson entirely different from that given to those who leave out the deity. So in other words, unless we take our question to God and allow God to interpret it, we miss out on the deeper truth. So he concludes, so when you have the vision or the dream, remember that it is through understanding its abstract or absolute character that you will get the lesson and the right interpretation. So when we ask about the gender of God, at what level are we speaking? Are we speaking literally, metaphorically, metaphysically, archetypally, allegorically? These are all legitimate levels to ask this question. And we get a different answer depending on what level we are inquiring from. In short, God is an infinite living spirit. And as such, God includes all genders, and God transcends gender altogether. Both are true. And as we gaze upward from here below, we see God as male and female. And we see the divine feminine and divine masculine qualities of the divinity. We see God as an androgynous divine being. And if we gaze downward from the Godhead, from up there down to creation, we see God as transcendent of all dualities whatsoever, inclusive of all dualities and transcendent of all dualities. However, when it comes to the masculine and feminine qualities of God, we are here in creation as we look up to God. God says, Elohim says, I am male and female in this first chapter of Genesis. And therefore, it is far more accurate to say that God is half female, half male, than it is to say that God is male or that God is female, or even that God transcends all gender categories, because we are made in the image of God. This is a revelation from God. So in some sense, since we are half male, half female, God must also be. The principle of correspondence applies both ways. As above, so below. As below, so above. And so, how is it that we are made in the image of God? We are made in the image of God because we are male and female. And so, this is God's word. Are we going to deny God's own self-declared gender identity as androgynous? We here, progressives in Vancouver, where the whole theme of the day is to basically honor every being's self-declared gender identity. Are we going to deny that same respect to God that we afford to everyone else on the street? So, dare we say it, God is half female. And what we have done is we have projected onto God only half of our image and made an only male God. And so this is something that just simply needs to be corrected. Now, some scholars try to explain all this away by the use of the plural in Genesis as sort of a measure of respect. It's called the pluralis majestatis, the majestic plural. It's like in German or many languages where you use the plural as a matter of respect to your elders. In German you say, wie geht es Ihnen? You don't say, wie gehst du? It's too informal, too not okay. You use that plural as a form of respect for your elders, your superiors. So that's one way, the royal we, in which this is sometimes explained away. But it doesn't hold up because God gives the answer right there, and Elohim is frequently used in the plural. And God says male and female. Another dismissal that you'll find is the grammatic ruah, the different words in Hebrew, that the masculine gender is applied to many words, sometimes those that have neutral gender, or sometimes plural genders, which are given then all lumped under the masculine gender, which itself has a little bit of a patriarchal twist there. But here's the key. When the feminine pronoun is used in Hebrew, it means very specifically something very definitely feminine. And the word ruach, the noun for the Spirit of God, is very specifically and distinctly feminine. And the consistent use of feminine nouns and verbs to refer to the Spirit of God is found throughout the Torah. So at least this aspect of Elohim was clearly and definitely perceived as feminine. So in closing, the Godhead may be beyond gender altogether. But the divinity of God, the qualities of God, are both masculine and feminine. And this has major consequences for the practice of religion. And there is yet a deeper reason for all of this. For the fact that God is male and female, that has something to do with a profound and sacred secret of the communion of these different aspects of God, of the masculine and the feminine, that give birth to creation. So there's a very deep esoteric secret here. And this entails the feminine and masculine aspects of God in their beloved communion. And so, in honor of that, Cynthia and I would like to close with a kind of a meditation on the gender communion of God. This comes from the great Hindu mystic from Maharashtra, Janeshwar.
So I invite you to just close your eyes again for a moment, or have a soft gaze. Just be for a moment with all that has been offered. I honor the God and the Goddess, the eternal parents of the universe. What beauty! Both are made of the same nectar and share the same food.
Out of supreme love, they swallow each other up, but separate again for the joy of being two.
They are not completely the same, but neither are they different. None can tell exactly what they are.
How sweet is their love! The entire universe is too small to contain them, yet they live happily together in the tiniest particle and in the heart of every being.
Without the God, there is no goddess. Without the goddess, there is no God. How sweet is their love!
Embracing each other, they merge into one, as darkness merges with the light at the breaking of dawn.
When they discover their unity, all words and all thoughts dissolve into silence.
When we discover their unity, all words and all thoughts dissolve into silence.
May it be so.
Oh, a woman is a flower, a blossom in the spring. All the wonder and the promise of the sweetest fruit she'll bring. And the wind comes rustling through her, and all her petals sing. And she's a dark, rich soil. She's the sunlight from above. Oh, a woman is a garden made for love. And a woman is a flower. She's honeysuckle on the vine. In the lazy heat of summer, she's a nectar sweet as wine. And if you lean a little closer, around you she will twine. 'Cause she's a dark, rich soil. She's the sunlight from above. Oh, a woman is a garden made for love. And a little bit of peace and a little bit of care, and you touch her tenderly. She can sing an open heart and bless a tired soul. She'll love you tenderly. And a woman is a flower. She's blushed with pink a rose. Leaves you heady in her fragrance, leaves you breathless in the glow. And in autumn's sweet unfolding, a woman surely knows that she's a dark, rich soil. She's the sunlight from above. Oh, a woman is a garden made for a little bit of peace and a little bit of care. And you touch her tenderly. And when winter's winds are blowing and the drifts of winter snowing, and you open up to see that she's a dark, rich soil. She's the sunlight from above. Oh, a woman is a garden